Greetings, students. As promised on Tuesday, we are now going to consider the topic of how psychologists ask and answer questions. As we talked about on Tuesday, psychology is considered a science because of using the scientific method. This particular method helps psychologists to explore questions related to human and animal behavior, but doing so in a way that minimizes our inherent biases. So one of the methods that we use is description. This is linked to observation, where we observe things and we just describe what we observe. In correlation, we look at the relationships between variables. Oftentimes people will hear correlation reported in a manner like this. Studies have found that there's a relationship between smoking and heart disease. Oftentimes people misunderstand correlation and they believe when they hear something like that, that one thing causes the other. Correlation can't speak to whether one thing caused the other. It simply reports a relationship between two or more things. Another method that's used is the experiment, also depicted here as experimentation, and it is here that we're able to talk about cause and effect relationships. And the reason for that is, in an experiment, variables are manipulated. A process is set up in which we look at two or more things and we keep things pretty much the same between the two groups and then manipulate one thing for one of the groups. Because of all of the other conditions being the same, if there is change between the two groups, then we can attribute it to having been caused by the manipulation of the variable presented to the one group. So looking a little bit more at the scientific method, it's really a cycle in which we come up with a question or a theory, and our interest in that question leads us to develop a hypothesis. The hypothesis is our attempt to understand the answer to that question, or to suggest our understanding of what we think the answer to that question might be. And so once we've developed that hypothesis, then we can go on to the next step, which is going to be research and observation. Here you can see the cycle depicted, beginning with the theory of the question, having that lead us to the hypothesis, which then leads us to our research and observation. From our research and observation, we reach a conclusion, and once we have that conclusion, we can either confirm that, reject that, or revise it, which would take us back to the beginning of the cycle. So here you see an example of looking at the effect of sleep and memory, the effect of sleep on memory. So someone starts off with the question or the theory that sleep is going to boost your memory. And in wondering about that, you might decide to yourself as a hypothesis that sleep deprivation leads to memory loss. People remember less when they haven't had enough sleep. So then in order to check out that hypothesis, you might have two groups of people in which you give them material to study before going to sleep. Now, one of the groups of people will probably get a full night's sleep, whereas the other group of people will not get a full night's sleep. And here we're going to see how much of the material that we gave them to study they'll be able to remember following their particular experiences of sleep. this process of experimentation, there are some important terms to remember. A theory is an explanation that's used to help organize information that we take in, such as our observation, our predictions of events and behaviors. A hypothesis is a testable prediction that's often implied or drawn out from the theory that we have about the way things might work. An operational definition is a carefully worded statement of the exact steps that you take in your research study. This is important because one part of the process using the scientific method is to make sure that the work that you do can be followed by other scientists, other investigators and researchers. We call that process of following replication. And in replication, we repeat the essence of the research study, sometimes with different participants in different situations, but pretty much in the same way that the original researcher did it. And we do this so that we can see if we get the same results, and of course, if we do get the same results, that builds evidence showing that we might be on the right path to the truth. Of course, not all theories are good theories, and when we're thinking about theories, we want to be able to detect a good theory and to distinguish that from a theory that's not as useful. So here are some things to think about when you're analyzing or thinking about a theory. A good theory is going to effectively organize information or data so that we can make sense of that data. It's going to help us to come to clear predictions about behavior and the reoccurrence of that behavior. A good theory is a theory that allows us to do research. If the theory is stated in such a way that we can't research it, you might remember that I talked about how Freud's theory is difficult to research. And that is one of the reasons why many clinicians and researchers and theorists have difficulty with his work, because you cannot research it to determine whether it's true or false. So a good theory is definitely going to allow you to determine whether it's true or false. And then finally, a good theory is one that can be replicated. Once we're ready to test out a theory, test out a hypothesis so that we can refine our theories, there are several methods that we can use to do that. We can use a descriptive method, we can use a correlational method, or we can use an experimental method in which we manipulate variables. The descriptive method gives us several ways of observing and describing information. We could use the case study method to do that, and in this method we're going to work with one person and we're going to gather a lot of detail about that one person. So its advantage is that it allows us to examine an individual in depth. And doing that might help us to get some great ideas to explore with other people. A disadvantage, though, is that it can't be used to generalize to other people. Because we're only working with one person, we can't assume that that person's experience fits for everyone else. Another method that we can use using the descriptive method is called naturalistic observation. In this method, the researcher goes into the natural environment of humans or animals and observes them directly in their natural environment. This is a great thing to do if you want to be sure that the behavior you're observing is the normal, regular behavior that that human being or that animal does. Taking them out of their environment oftentimes changes their behavior, so going into their environment gives you the advantage that they may be behaving the way that they normally behave. And of course, in this method, we can describe what's going on, but it doesn't allow us to explain what's going on. It can give us some ideas about what's going on because what we learn in that natural environment can be very revealing. The final method in the descriptive method is surveys and interviews. While the case study confines us to working with one person, surveys and interviews allows us to work with a larger number of people. So in this method, we get to examine many cases, but unlike the case study, we don't get to go into as much depth. Obviously, if we're giving someone a survey, if that survey was too long, most people wouldn't respond to that survey. So we gather a briefer amount of information, but we get to spread that out with a larger number of people. However, when you're putting together a survey or you're working with an interview with people, you have to think about a few things. One of them is the effect of wording. Sometimes wording things a particular way will cause confusion in the people taking the survey, which would result in that some people might interpret the wording one way and respond to it that way, and others might respond to it in a totally different way. Or it may be worded in such a way that it influences the response that the person gives. So you have to be careful about wording in creating your surveys and interviews. And then you want to make sure that you have a random sampling of people to distribute your survey or interview to. This is very important because if you are looking for information that you want to generalize to others, you want to be careful that you don't just happen to get a group of people who would all respond the same way or who think the same way because of some link that they may have in their characteristics. So it's really important to make sure the sampling or the people who are chosen to be in your study are representative of all the people that you hope to generalize to. So again, just to go over these quickly, the case study is a technique in which one person is studied in depth. Naturalistic observation, the researcher goes into the natural environment and observes and records behavior that naturally occurs there. The survey method gives us an opportunity to reach a broader audience. We can allow that audience to self-report about questions that we ask on the survey. And if we use random sampling, we're able to then take the information we get from that group and apply that to a larger group. I mentioned a couple of terms that may not be familiar to you: population, random sample. So let's talk about those for a few minutes. A population, in scientific terms, is all the members of a group that are of interest for studying. So for example, let's say that I wanted to study men. The population of men would include every man on the planet. That's the entire population. If you think about that, wanting to study men, but having to find every single man on the planet, you might realize that that would be a cumbersome enterprise, and that's something that we can't do. So what we do is we use a process where we come up with a population sample, a group of people that represents that entire group, but that is smaller and more manageable, and we work with them instead.